Welcome, everyone. We're just waiting for folks to join us. We'll start in another minute or two. Thanks for your patience and thanks so much for being prompt. I'm going to say we'll start by 12:04, so that gives us 2 more minutes if you're just patient and bear with us. If you have brought your lunch to our virtual lunch hour, by all means, you should begin your lunch. And we will get started in just a minute.
Boy, this is great.
All right, 1 more minute. Thank you for your patience. This virtual lunch is our second virtual lunch of the season. We also do most of our programming in person. So if you're local to Boston, we hope that you will come and visit us here for one of our on-site programs. And if you're not local to Boston and you come and visit, you should check out our calendar to see if we have anything on the docket at that time that would work for you. So it's 12:04. I don't want us to lose a lot of time, so we'll begin. Hi, my name is Elise Winnick, and I'm the Director of Arts and Culture here at the Vilna Shul. Delighted to have all of you here with us. The Vilna, if you're not familiar, is a 1919 built historic synagogue building in which our Center for Jewish Arts and Culture is situated. I like to say that the job of the Vilna is to translate the past for the sake of the future. And I can certainly tell you that the founding members of the Vilna Shul, when they came from Lithuania in the early 20th century, could not possibly imagine that we would be doing a program right now with people in different homes, different cities across the country, and having a conversation. They probably wouldn't have even expected us to have this particular conversation, but they certainly couldn't have guessed that we would have it in this way. A few kind of laundry list logistical announcements before we get started. Please keep yourselves on mute so that we're all able to hear the speakers. Again, if you brought your lunch, this is the Vilna virtual lunch, and you should please feel free to eat your lunch. If you have questions in the course of the presentation, please drop them into the chat. The program piece itself will go for about 30 minutes or so, and then we'll go to questions, and I'll be sharing the questions with our panelists at that time. And so you can put your questions in the chat, and we'll collect all of them. And our goal will be to be finished today at or around 1 p.m. to let you get back to your busy days. I'm incredibly excited to introduce to you our 2 panelists for this behind the scenes look at Broadway, and from an angle you probably haven't considered before, and that's the experience of the audience. We think a lot about the players, we think a lot about the craftspeople who make the play come to life, but we don't think quite as much about what's the experience like for us as theater goers. First, I'll introduce to you Heni Koenigsberg. Heni is a Tony, Drama Desk, Drama League, Outer Critics Circle, and GLAAD Media Award-winning Broadway producer. Just last week, Leopoldstadt, which we'll be talking about today, took home 4 Tony Awards, including Best Play. Mazel tov, Heni. We're very excited that you are able to share some time with us in the middle of this very busy season, and we're excited for the success that Leopoldstadt has had. As a supporter of education in the arts, Heni created a visiting artist program at the Walnut Hills School for the Arts, which brought successful artists to the school to work with students in the creative arts. Heni is a supporter of shows in development and apprenticeship programs for BIPOC, trans communities, and young artists who wish to pursue a career in theater. She's also a member of the JNF Arts and Culture Task Force. That committee is dedicated to bringing theater, music, dance, and visual arts programming to all communities in Israel. I am also excited to share with you, to introduce to you, Laura Yares. Laura is an assistant professor of religious studies at Michigan State University. She has a joint appointment in the MSU program for Jewish studies. Her research and her teaching focuses on Jews and Judaism in modernity, with particular interest in Jewish education. Right now, she is currently at work co-authoring a contemporary ethnographic project exploring Jewish learning in cultural arts settings. The research investigates the ways that museums, TV shows, digital media, music, and theater are vibrant settings for Jews and non-Jews to learn about Judaism and Jewishness. So let's begin. And let's begin with a little deeper understanding of what are the particular expertise and skills that bring you each to our panel today. So Laura, tell us a bit about what you study as an ethnographer and how our conversation today is relevant to that.
Yes, thank you, Elise, and thank you to you all for being here. Thank you to the Vilna Show for hosting us. So I'm a professor of religious studies, and I do ethnographic work looking at people in real time. So I'm really studying people to understand how they create meaning in their social lives and their cultural worlds. I use the tools of ethnography to try and see the world through the eyes of the people that I'm studying, standing very much in their footsteps and trying to understand how they might see the world and what are some of the things that influence the ways that they see the world. And as Elise mentioned in my bio, I'm really interested in education. And by that, I mean situations of teaching and learning. So with the context of cultural arts, what I'm really interested in doing is situating myself in the seat of the audience and trying to understand, what do people learn when they go and see theatre productions? Of course, they're entertained. Of course, they go as a social activity. But I'm rather convinced that when people see plays on Broadway and watch TV shows and other things, there's also a lot of learning that is going on about Jewish ideas and Jewish themes.
Terrific, thank you. And Heni, I'm sure that most of us really have no idea what the role of a producer is in a Broadway play or in any other performance context. So could you give us a little bit of insight into what your role is as a producer?
Absolutely. It usually takes a play or a musical anywhere from 5 to 10 years to go from page to stage. And depending on who, what, when, I get involved as a producing partner or a co-producer somewhere, sometimes towards the beginning when a show is in development, or sometimes at the very end, a group of us are called to come in and help usher in a new project or a revival. Broadway itself represents about $17 billion worth of income to the city of New York. And there are about 1 million jobs that are tangentially related to both on restaurant industries, hotel industries. There are levels of producing. There's the lead producer that comes in usually right at the get-go and hires the director. As a producing partner or a co-producer, I come in at the next level, and usually it takes a village to put a show on stage. And I will come in, I will see a show in development, I will give notes, I will talk to the lead producer, and then what been funded, and this is all private, it's not nonprofit, will raise money, because the shows can cost anywhere from a few $1 million to a play, a simple play off Broadway, to upwards of $20 million. And I can be part of, I've been asked to be part of helping to make script changes, sit through auditions, make recommendations, but it is a community that comes together. So I put on lots of hats. I do marketing for shows, whatever is needed to get that show up there and to make the experience for the audience as good as possible.
Well, that's a perfect segue for my next question. I wanted us to hear a little bit about what you're thinking about with regard to the audience when you are in the midst of preparing a production.
So, and by the time we get to, the rehearsal stage for usually 6 to 8 weeks, sometimes there's an out-of-town tryout, but really and truly, we're up there to entertain. Whether it's a serious play like Leopoldstadt or a big splashy musical like Funny Girl, the key is to entertain. If you lose your audience, you've lost everything. And the bottom line is the bottom line, and we're there to put bottoms in seats and only to entertain. If you get a play like Leopoldstadt, which I've had with other plays, I was a producer on the Lehman trilogy, a show, also a Jewish themed show recently, The Inheritance, a revival of A Raisin in the Sun. If there are teachable moments and the audience is caught in the moment and they walk away changed, that's a win, because you've now given them an experience that they will carry with them for hopefully forever.
Amazing. So Laura, from the lens that you approach it, what do you think that audience experience means as an educator? I think that Heni's point about the educational potential of a show is tremendous. What have you discovered about audience experience in this context?
Yeah, Elise, I love that question, and I'd like to answer by sort of zooming out to the sort of 10,000 Jewish feet, right? When we think about Jewish education and sites of Jewish education and institutions of Jewish education, and questions like who's Jewishly educated, who's Jewishly literate, we tend to think mostly about classrooms, right? And research has really focused on classrooms. So we think about Hebrew schools, we think about day schools, we think about non-classroom, but still sort of institutional settings like camp or trips to Israel, such as on Birthright. And generally, I think the prevailing assumption is that anybody who hasn't been socialized within that educational ecosystem probably doesn't know much about Judaism, right? Are not people that we would consider to be Jewishly educated. Now, as an ethnographer, again, I'm really interested in how people make meaning. And it seems to me, and here I'm really kind of standing in a broader field of literature about how adults learn, and the fact that learning is really a lifelong process that we're all doing throughout the course of our lives, right? We're having this wonderful lunch and learn. We read books, we watch documentaries, we listen to reports on media stations like NPR. We have conversations with people who come from different cultures and contexts to the ones that we come from. And all of these things are educational experiences. They're all encounters through which we learn not only new content, but we learn new affective understandings, right? New understandings of how to be a person in the world and how that looks different for different people. And when we think of education in that much broader sense of lifelong learning, and we map that onto the question of who is Jewishly educated and what does it mean to know things and understand things about who Jews are and what Judaism is, I think it's quite obvious that going to see a theatre production, right, could be an educational institution. Which isn't to say that theatre sets out to be a school-like environment, right? As Heni has said, this is leisure time entertainment, and that's the bottom line. But theatre productions do educational programming, right? They will host visits from schools and do workshop in schools, and that's what we might call explicitly, right? Explicitly didactic or explicitly educational. What I'm really interested in is what is going on for your average audience member in the seats who is not enrolled in a formal educational program, but nevertheless, as a result of seeing Leopoldstadt or seeing another play, what do they Google? What do they look up on Wikipedia? What do they go and watch next on the stage, on Netflix? What kind of conversations do they have afterwards? What books do they pick up? Because my suspicion, and again, really thinking here about literature, about how adults learn as a lifelong process, is that experiences like going to see a play are never isolated experiences. They're always part of a chain of experiences and learning that is contributing to this project of lifelong adult Jewish education.
Amazing, thank you. And our conversations, Laura, about that layering of experiences have really begun to influence my own thinking as an educator. So I thank you for that. Let's hone in a little bit more specifically for the moment on Leopoldstadt itself. Heni, when we first met, the three of us, to talk about this program, you told us a really interesting story about the origins of the play. Is that something that you can share with the group now?
Absolutely. So I mentioned there's usually a lead producer who helms this, and the lead producer was Sonia Friedman, who's quite famous. She's a British producer, and Tom Stoppard is a British playwright. One day, Sonia received a phone call, and she's produced a number of his plays. And if you don't know anything about Stoppard, he actually he's an Oscar winner for now I'm blanking on it, the Romeo and Juliet, the Shakespeare in Love. He won the Oscar for that, but he also wrote Travesties, and he's won a Tony for that. It's like 5-time Tony winner, considered one of the greatest and arguably the greatest playwright of the 20th century. Tom called Sonia one day and said, I'm writing a new play. He was 80 years old. This was back in 2018. And he said, I want you to produce it. And Sonia said, well, of course. So 5 weeks later, she gets about 5 pages of text. Okay. Another 4 or 5 weeks go by. She gets another 3-4 pages of text. And this goes on for about 4 or 5 months. And so she decides to go visit Tom. She goes to Tom, and he's got a house in the country. And she walks in and sits down, and he says to her, don't you want to know what I'm writing about? And she said, of course. Stoppard. She wasn't going to question anything that he was writing. She was going to say, yes, it's Stoppard. You never say no to Stoppard. So he leans over and he whispers in her ear and says, it's about being Jewish. And he proceeded to tell her that he did not know that he was fully Jewish until he was in his mid to late 50s. And it was a cousin who actually informed him. He knew that he had a mother who was fully Jewish, which of course we all know makes you Jewish, but his father had died. He was born, and Tom himself was born in Czechoslovakia. They left. The father had died in the war, and they moved to Italy, and then the mother remarried. They wound up in Britain. And he was raised in London, and he considers himself a British playwright. Not a Jewish playwright, Jewish playwright. And one day he got together with a cousin when he was in his mid-50s, and they were talking about their past. And the cousin looked at him and he said, I guess they were talking about being Jewish. Cousin said, well, don't you understand? You're Jewish. And he said, I am. He had never grappled with that notion. And so this is his coming to terms with who he is and where he came from. At the age of 80.
It's an astonishing story. I think about folks like Tom Stoppard, like Madeleine Albright, who only discovered the fullness of their identity well into adulthood. And I can't imagine what that revelation is like. Do you think that audiences feel that in the telling of the story in Leopoldstadt, or do you think that that's kind of a driving force for Tom, but it's the narrative itself as opposed to the revelatory piece of it that comes through?
So I think it was step one, and I think I would reverse that. And I think it was something that he felt that he needed to write about. Everything he writes about is revelatory. I mean, I don't know, how does genius work? And we can talk about that audience experience now, or, later on. It is crafted in a way, it's semi-autobiographical is the way I would place it. I mean, he is not from Vienna or Austria, but he's crafted it. It's a cast of 38 actors. So it's this ginormous production that spans 3 generations. And the audience sits there completely enthralled. And we can talk about their experience at the end. I'd love to hear what Laura's thinking at this point too.
Well, so we'll definitely come on to that. And one of the things that I want to talk about in that context, which we will come to, but I'm just giving you a teaser, is the role of the Seder in the narrative and how that exists within the story and how that impacts on the audience. But before we get to that, I wanted to hear your thinking about, in February, neo-Nazis protested outside of Parade. And I'm curious, outside that first preview, I'm curious how you felt affected by that. And I'm curious about the Leopoldstadt family, how people felt about that moment.
So there's no question that the theater community and the Broadway community is a community that comes together, I think, and supports one another. When we first entered into that COVID pandemic phase, it became clear that there were communities that worked on Broadway that felt marginalized. In particular, what we call the BIPOC community, Black, Indigenous, queer, LGBTQIA+ communities, and that it needed to be addressed. No one ever addressed the anti-Semitic problem that exists in the world. There have been shows like, listen, Cabaret. I've now co-produced New York, New York by John Kander, who is now, John is 96 and just wrote this. It's astonishing that these guys are still writing, but it gets addressed on the stage sometimes. That moment had not been addressed. We are a small part of the population, or Jewish people, 2 to 3% of the population, if that, in this country. When that happened, when those protests happened, we all came together as a community. People really stood their ground, just like we did when the BIPOC community said, you're marginalizing us. People were appalled. And it is an industry filled with a disproportionately large number of Jews who work in it. I would say I was shocked when I first came to it, and I sat down in a meeting, and this was on a show randomly. I think it was a Porgy and Bess meeting, like 15 years ago. I couldn't. We were scheduling a marketing meeting in the future, and someone said, "Oh no, can't do that. It's Sukkot. We can't. So and so can't be there." And I just was flabbergasted. And everyone knows that when it comes to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, you either don't run a show or you have an alternate cast. So we rallied. So when it happened with Parade, we rallied. Leopoldstadt was such a juggernaut of a show right from the get-go that there was nothing that would affect it. So I would say, Parade came in as this, this show. It was a revival. People were shocked and stunned, but it did not affect our numbers at all. And we have a primarily Jewish cast. And so we existed. We stayed longer than any other play, actually, that has been running on Broadway as a new production.
Very interesting. Laura, in your research, did audience goers, did theater goers, did audiences comment at all on that element, on the kind of anti-Semitic aura that existed around Parade, and perhaps for them extended for other productions as well?
Definitely. So in the research for this is a chapter of the book that I'm working on Broadway theatre. I've been looking at 3 plays: Parade, Leopoldstadt, and The Wanderers. And so I spoke to audience members who had been both to Parade and also to Leopoldstadt. And I heard a variety of things, and I'd like to highlight a couple of them. For some of the audience members that I spoke to, the neo-Nazi protests were really a signal towards defiance, right? Towards audience members saying, we know that there are those people who have these, corrupted ideologies and are out to do us harm, but here we are, our stories are on Broadway, and we should defiantly still celebrate our traditions and see these shows and how wonderful it is. Like we have the last laugh, and we should be coming to, we shouldn't be afraid, right, to come to the theater and see these shows. We should be defiant. A second theme that I heard from audience members is that the neo-Nazi protests highlighted a theme that was resonant for them in both of these plays, which is that anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic violence isn't something that only exists in the past. One of the things that we heard audience members talk about a lot when we talked to them about these plays was the idea that that they show the sort of steps that build up to these sort of crescendo moments, right? These awful, crescendo moments of course the Holocaust and then the lynching of Leo Frank in the case of Parade, right? That it shows the sort of the steps, the way that these ideologies sort of built over time, right, to result in these, of course, atrocities. And they could see how the neo-Nazi protests outside of Parade fit within that kind of playbook, within that schema of events, right? And so it seemed to indicate, right, that the past was very much here in the present, right? And that these kinds of protests could almost be a scene in either one of these shows. In a sense, perhaps we've learned nothing from history.
And it's really striking that in some ways this unfortunate protest in some ways I think really lifted up the experiences in those shows because of the way in which it made the past present, which I think is a really fascinating moment. We would have all preferred for those protests not to have happened, and we can't know what kind of how the shows would have sat in the cultural milieu without them, because now we only experienced it with that having happened and having anti-Semitism present in a way that it hasn't been in quite some time. I want to go back to that Passover Seder thought. The Passover Seder is a really interesting trope in the play. The moment towards the beginning where they're talking about the Passover Seder while decorating the Christmas tree is, I think, a really interesting stamp on contemporary and evolving Jewish identity. Heni, I'm wondering if you can comment at all on what you think the role of the Seder is in the play itself. And then Laura, I'm going to want you to reflect on, does the audience feel like they are experiencing something akin to going to a Seder in certain ways by being in the theater? So those first, Heni, on how the Seder fits into the narrative of the play, and then Laura on the experience of the Seder as the experience of a play.
So Jews have a tradition of remembering, not forgetting, and the idea of telling the story every year so we don't forget is, I think it was pretty brilliant of Stoppard to have done that and made that a focus at the very beginning. What's striking about it is that Christmas tree with the Jewish star on top, which is, pretty incredible. But the idea that Jews believed, and it was the theme, and one of the reasons that Tom wrote this and really had trouble remembering is because the idea that, and many of you may know this from your, having studied history, that assimilation was thought to have been the answer to anti-Semitism, or being anti-Jewish, as we say. By the way, Semitism was a term that Hitler created. It sounded nicer than saying anti-Jew, and it does, doesn't it? So I would say that it is, that's the idea of telling, remembering. That's Stoppard's way of saying we need to remind people, we need to tell the story, and to tell the story of our Judaism. There it is, right before you, the Christmas tree and the Jewish Seder.
Wonderful. Laura?
Yeah, so I'd like to start with that image of the Christmas tree, because it's such a powerful one. When the play opens, you see this scene, the family is getting ready for a holiday party, and there's this beautiful large Christmas tree, and with the Jewish star on top. And I had a lot of people who were in the audience at Leopoldstadt say some version of, wow, that was so meaningful to me to see that, because that's how I live my Judaism, right? This sort of fusion of cultural influences from disparate family members, either within their own families or through close relationships that they might have with others. And people were amazed that this blending, this fusion, this what we call in anthropology hybridity, right? Living as hybrid between multiple cultural worlds. This isn't an invention of the 20th century, right? So much of the discourse on assimilation and intermarriage, in America today, describes it, and I'm going to use inverted commas here. I'm quoting, not endorsing, as a modern problem, right? As something that is something that contemporary Jews are doing because they are, again, quote, like sort of not attached enough to Jewish values. And it was so meaningful, I think, for a lot of audience members to see that this hybridity, this blending, this fusion, right, of different identities is actually nothing new. That we can trace that back into Jewish history, actually a very, very long way. Maybe not in the particular form of the Christmas tree, but historians of Judaism will tell us that Jews have always blended, right, with majority cultures in order to create distinctive forms of Jewish identity and practice. So I think it was very, very meaningful for audience members to see that that these kinds of practices, right, date back to the 19th century rather than the 20th century. And then the Seder, right? The second scene after the Christmas tree is the one around the Seder. And when we think about a Seder, of course, the Seder is the sort of paradigmatic teaching event, right, in the Jewish holiday calendar. It's explicitly framed as a tradition, as a ritual that is meant to instruct and to teach, you know, what it means to be a member of the Jewish people. And it's also one in which historically non-Jews, right, have been invited to participate, right? Let all who are hungry come and eat. So again, I think this Seder moment with this table that is a fusion of Jewish family members, of non-Jewish family members, of children who have grown up with Jewish and non-Jewish parents, coming together and figuring out, you know, how to narrate the Hebrew, how to say the blessings, felt like it was something that I think contemporary audience members could really relate to. You could have taken that scene and put it in the 21st century. Now, one last thing that I'll note about the Seder, which I heard from a lot of people who describe themselves in various ways as very much Jewish insiders, right? As people who were very familiar with Jewish ritual, with Jewish liturgy, from cantors and rabbis that we talked to. There was a moment in the Seder that actually was problematic for them, that made them kind of switch off and say, these people don't quite know what they're doing here, right? As much as I do. And that is that the scene uses that familiar tune for Manishtana, right? That many of you on the Zoom today might be familiar with. Manishtana halayla hazeh. And that tune wasn't invented until after the time period in which the scene is set. So for some people who have deep insider knowledge, right, these moments could be jarring, right? It sort of signaled that in some ways that they were almost kind of too knowledgeable for what was being shown on the stage, and that was really, really interesting too.
Can I piggyback onto that? It's very interesting you say that. My rabbi had a problem with, there's a reference in there to Palestinians and Arabs. And the fact is that, and he actually wrote to Tom about it and said, this is not really correct. Palestinians before 42 were always Israelis and were always Jewish. I'm going to take it back to what I said at the very beginning and what we expect is art to the stage. We're there to entertain. It is, this is not a documentary. People criticize the movie. That wasn't completely factual. And I would say that as long as they were entertained, they were kept mesmerized, which they are, that's the point of bringing commercial theater to the stage. We did it with To Kill a Mockingbird too. That was one of my shows as well, which educated, but you know, do authors take those liberties? Of course they do.
And I think that's really important to recognize, because with that, on the one hand, we could sort of nitpick, right, the historical authenticity and accuracy, but on the other hand, I think we have to remember the affective resonance, what's going on emotionally, right, when we use certain kind of tropes and themes. And I think for so many audience members, that tune for Manishtana is the one that they know, that takes them back to maybe their childhood Seder tables, to, you know, to warm and happy memories. So maybe it's more important to use a tune that is going to register emotionally for the audience than one that is necessarily completely historically accurate. And so that's one of the things that I've been kind of sifting through with talking.
So the bigger picture is, you may think you're assimilating, but guess what? You're not Jewish, you're married to a Jew, we're coming for you. So I think that's the big picture. And I think, you know, that when you bring page to stage, the idea of keeping your audience engaged is more important.
You know, it's fascinating because you anticipate kind of a suspension of reality when you step into the theater. You're not actually, it's not like you're reading a textbook, and it's not like you've gone to see a documentary. You're going to immerse yourself in an experience. And I think that depending on your level of familiarity with whatever the content is that the production is about, either you're brought in more because you've heard something familiar, and the fact that it is out of the correct time and place doesn't matter to you because you don't know, and that actually makes it more absorbing for you, and your suspension of reality gets hijacked, if you will, if you know something about the historical accuracy and you don't see it there. So it's very interesting how the audience comes in, and this goes back to what you were talking about before, Laura, in terms of the layering of experiences. Who you are when you walk into the room can have a very significant impact on your experience of the production, which has absolutely nothing to do with the production and the quality of the production, because the individual audience member's experience is really very much framed by who they were when they walked through the door. So with that in mind, what would you say, Laura, is the lasting impact of this cycle of plays? And I don't mean just Leopoldstadt, but I mean this moment in time where Leopoldstadt and Parade and The Wanderers and several other things of Jewish impact. What do you think is the lasting impact of this moment in theatrical time, if you will, on both the folks who were in the audience and the ones who, like many of us, heard about it, read it, know things about it, but weren't actually in the room to see the production themselves?
Yeah, absolutely. That's such a great question. So I think it cannot be overstated, right, that these plays, and particularly Parade and Leopoldstadt, were really a moment in which Jewish themes and characters and playwrights and actors were getting big billing on Broadway, right? And in some ways that represents the mainstreaming of Jewish culture, that these plays didn't only attract Jewish audiences, but non-Jewish audiences as well. Right, so I spoke to a lot of young people, for example, who went to see Parade, and they really were drawn to it because of Ben Platt, who is the starring actor in the show. Right, they knew who he was, they know about Dear Evan Hansen, and they want to see him, and they were almost blindsided by learning the story of Leo Frank, and didn't expect it to sort of turn out in the way that it did. So telling these stories in a way that invites in a broader audience, right, both Jewish and non-Jewish, that includes Jews and non-Jews, of course, in the storyline as well, I think is really, really major. I also just want to set this in the context of, like, this is still very much happening in a kind of post-COVID moment, right? This is, you know, and Lenny, Heni, I think can talk to this maybe even more than I can, right? The theaters were shuttered for a significant amount of time, and then in the sort of first season, after they reopened, there was, I think, a bit of an emphasis on productions that were kind of light and optimistic and hopeful. And as the die happened to roll in this sort of second season after COVID, we've got these two really sort of meaty, heavy plays that ask people to really grapple with the question of what it means to be a Jew in the contemporary world at this time of rising anti-Semitism. And I think that this, as well as the recent White House report and other sort of cultural touch points as well, will sort of go down in Jewish history as an indication that Jews are wrestling with this moment in Jewish history, right, with the sort of rising profile of anti-Semitism, not only through advocacy, not only through sort of, you know, political lobbying, but also through cultural production.
You know, it's interesting, Heni, you said that it's 5 to 10 years from page to stage. That means that these productions were already underway before. Which is not to say we hadn't already started to see anti-Semitism on the rise at the earlier part of that time frame, but these productions were already underway. And here we are, this moment in time that they blossomed into reality. with the current context. There's something about that that's kind of, it's maybe it's serendipity, but it's a little bit surreal that they would all come to the stage at the same time in this particular moment.
There are a lot, but I would say cabaret goes pretty far back. And you know what's more poignant, than a musical like that? I will say I actually have, this is the moment to be making this statement. I have a new show, a new musical written. Barry Manilow has been working on this with Bruce Sussman for 20 years because he's so busy. New musical called Harmony, all about a German group of singers. They were like the Beatles back in the 20s and 30s, comprised of 3 Jews and 3 Gentiles. They had, I can't remember, like 90 records, 7 films. I'll give you just a brief moment. No one's ever heard of them. They're the most famous group from the 20s and 30s that you've never heard of. And they were invited, NBC offered them a contract. And what did they decide to do in the 30s? They went back. And what do you figure happened? I will make, I just wanted to make a point about, and that's coming. If anybody wants information, absolutely get in touch with me. It's coming this November. It is, we find that the audiences that are non-Jewish are completely silent at the end of the show. They are rapt and they are changed. And they are changed because they now feel that they have to look at their own history to understand their what legacy they have personally inherited. Leopoldstadt, we have an expression in Leopoldstadt that we can never forget. And those who forget the past are condemned to repeat it. So I give you that thought, and that's generally our audience reaction.
Amazing. We're coming up on 10 minutes to the hour, so we're going to open up for questions. But before we do that, Heni, can we see your Tonys? Oh,
well, okay. So I'll show you a Tony.
Okay.
This was for Hadestown. The reason I don't have Leopoldstadt is because these medallions are engraved specifically to each winner, and they don't know who the winners are, of course. There are no fake envelopes that get mixed up, and that usually takes months to do. But that's what the Tony looks like. So
thank you for sharing that. Thank you. Very exciting. If anybody's interested in asking a question, believe me, I have more, but I want to give other people a chance to participate too. So if you want to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question, we'd love to hear your voices. Don't be shy.
Hi, my name is Sarah Schneider. I use she, her pronouns. I work at Mannheim, and I'm also a freelance stage manager. And I would love to hear a little bit about the many child actors in Leopoldstadt and how, if you know about how the rehearsal process was in terms of integrating them into this show with really challenging themes, and if that process was any different than a typical child actor in a Broadway process where they're just plugged in to the work that the adults are doing.
So yes, there are tutors and there are special psychologists. We have them on any show where there are children. You need to have 3 actors, 3 child actors for every role that a child plays on Broadway, because they can't miss school. And there are lots of therapists involved, not just for children, for adults too. I mean, it's pretty traumatic. I mean, these actors themselves, most of them are Jewish. grappled with this. You could probably find Brandon Uranowitz, who played the key character, who discovers he's the child who, I don't know if any of you have seen it or have read the play. There's a moment that he has with a Nazi. There's an exchange when he's a child. He absolutely blocks this out, which is, we all think of that as the Tom Stoppard role. But Brandon grappled with his own Jewishness. And of course, that's what we do. We have to provide that help, that psychological help for all involved, whether it's this show or a show with themes that are difficult, sexual abuse, slavery, of course. It's a very sensitive community.
Great, thanks, Sarah, for that question. Anybody else want to chime in? I'll throw out another question while you're thinking. Henny, was there a different experience for you producing Leopoldstadt or any of the productions that you've done with Jewish content versus the ones that aren't?
Absolutely. Funny Girl. Let's take Funny Girl. Funny Girl has a theme of a very successful Jewish comedian, singer, and tells her story, the story of Fanny Bryce. Everyone knows it. Forbes just rated it the #1 biopic musical on Broadway ever of all time. Who doesn't know People? Don't Rain on My Parade. It's very uplifting. There are comedic moments, and they leave that show feel really great. Yeah, she loses the guy, but the funny Jewish comedian gets the handsome man, and she's successful, and it ends with her being successful. There is no real history that you have. It's the history of a Jewish immigrant country, and really hits the top. So when we take on, when I took on this show, Leopoldstadt, as I did with another heavy theme show, The Inheritance, not necessarily a Jewish themed show, but it dealt with the AIDS crisis and epidemic of the 80s. There's a different expectation of the audience. And that's when you really need to hire Sarah, to your point, you need to hire the therapist to be on board and to help with that. And you have lots of online information that's given. There are educational materials, by the way, that are sent out for schools in the area if they come to visit, and for ways to grapple with these difficult issues. But they're so important, and it's important that audiences really gravitated towards it and made an effort to come. And we were the most successful play on Broadway. It's unheard of that a play opens and runs this long. And so people were interested in coming.
Incredible. I'll pause again to see if there's one more question. And if not, I have one more question for Laura before we close, but I'll leave a little space in case somebody's going to chime in.
My name is Lauren and I use she, her pronouns. I was wondering, we started with this image of a Pesach Seder, and at the Pesach Seder, we tell our story and we tell it as though we are there, as though we are personally there. And one of my favorite traditions is that we not only tell the story of what our ancestors did before and what we would have done were we there, when we were there, but also we look forward and we talk about where we are going. We end, in fact, with this idea of where we will be next year. And I'm wondering, Heni, you spoke about your upcoming show. This is a moment in time where, for better or worse, there is a spotlight on us. And I wonder if you could both speak to a little bit of where you see us going next. What is the role that the theater community can play in helping to usher us toward a more peaceful future, or a place of more inclusion, more understanding, more acceptance, and ultimately, I don't know, a better world?
A good question. I think that that Jewish communities finally feel more comfortable telling our stories and telling more of our stories. There's also Prayer for the French Republic, which is directed by David Cromer, which is coming to Broadway next season. It was off Broadway, and the idea of harmony, telling this story, and this is a true story. Actually, French Republic is a true story too, but Harmony tells this intimate story of that is 100% true. This is not made up, and this is not from this one person's perspective, of these Jews who were persecuted and the Gentiles who were persecuted because they had friendships or they had business relationships with Jews. And I think that the idea of bringing more and more of our stories to the public eye and getting the recognition, having, as you said, Laura, people really stood up and said, no, we're going to recognize Parade and all these other stories. And Parade won a Tony Award for Best Revival. And so, and the idea that we bring more of our stories and that we're comfortable doing that, and recognizing other communities, not just Jewish communities, but all marginalized communities, and telling our stories, is a way for us to move forward. And I think at some point, one hopes that we don't forget, as I said, we don't forget our past. We never forget, as we do at this year, and that we don't repeat our past actions.
Well,
Amazing. Oh, go ahead, Laura.
I would just obviously endorse everything that Heni said, and maybe add just one note. You know, I think the power of the theater is obviously the power of an immersive experience, right? Of being in the room where it happens and seeing these stories brought to life. But they're not experiences that are necessarily accessible to a broad socio-economic demographic, right? Broadway is expensive, and understandably so. You know, Heni mentioned how much it takes to put on a show, and I think that, as well as, of course, you know, investing in these stories and making sure our stories are told, we also need to continue to invest in initiatives that bring non-traditional populations to see Broadway theatre. And so, you know, some of the populations that we were talking to as we've been talking to audience members from these two shows, are not only folks who, you know, are Stoppard fans and are Broadway fans and will go and see everything, but also kids who were seeing Leopoldstadt, and that was their first time ever in a theatre, because they were part of an initiative working with their local public school to bring them to see the show. And so I think that's the sort of the flip side of the coin, is also making sure that these stories are not only on the stage, but that the stage is accessible to broader audiences.
We do that, and in fact, that's why we have tours as well. But there is an effort to bring certainly our youth to these productions, not just our productions, but I know I have other shows where we've brought communities that can't afford tickets to go. They have access in other ways.
Terrific.
So good
Thank
point.
you. Thank you. And thanks to both of you for really a fascinating and rich conversation. Thanks to all of you who joined us on the call today. For those of you who have not had the good fortune of being able to see Leopoldstadt in the theater, Henny tells me it's coming to TV as a mini series. Go ahead.
Well, we hope so. Steven Spielberg picked up the option and he wants to make a mini series out of it.
So we'll all be hoping.
I don't know if I'm allowed to release that information, but I just put it out there.
We'll keep your secret. In addition to getting to see Leopoldstadt, again, I hope that you'll come and see us in person here at the Vilna. We have some great programming coming up soon. This Friday night, we have a Young Professionals Friday night dinner with a kind of camp barbecue experience as part of it. Next Tuesday night, we have an amazing jazz concert with Lithuanian percussionist Vladimir Tarasov and jazz journalist Howard Mandel. We have tours through the summer of our building and in the neighborhood, and we'll have additional summer programming happening. So we hope we'll get to see you, not just through the screen, but in person as well. And I thank you all again for being here with us today.